Happy Monday, everybody. We're on to week 12 of Foundations, which will be the last week before Aether Drift, which we're getting next week. And what I like to do every Monday is go over my meta review, covering the best decks and best of one according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, which is a way I can kind of keep things informational and remove my own bias. And then best of three, we'll be covering the Standard Challenge, which is a good tournament on Magic the Gathering Online, and is kind of what I like to use to keep track of what's going on in best of three. So with that, let's get started. So first up, number one in tier one, according to Untapped, is Mono Red Aggro. It's been this way. The format's somewhat solved, right? There's not going to be a whole lot to talk about this week. But this one is deciding to not run the Witchstalker Frenzies and not run the Might of the Meeks that we saw being explored last week, and instead is bringing back the Hired Claw, which is a staple within the format, was included in the Worlds build back in October. And this version is running 3 copies of Shock, and instead of the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy. So very similar list to what we've seen in the past. The other thing that I like to do is talk about the matchups in case you're new or returning to Magic the Gathering. Mono Red Aggro is favored against Dimir Midrange or Dimir Bounce. 5-color Reanimator, Gruul Aggro because it has more consistent mana, and Domain. It's a coin flip against Esper Self-Bounce, kind of depending on whether or not you come up against the Nowhere to Run and the Sheltered by Ghosts. Rakdos Aggro. It's also a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro, and it's weak to Mono Black Midrange, Boros Auras, Mardu Aggro. The opening hand I also like to cover, just in case you're kind of needing some guidance on what to look for in your opening hand. The top performing cards in your opening hand are Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, and Hired Claw. Number 2, according to the tracker, is Mardu Aggro, also in Tier 1 this week, and we see that the Feather of Flight got dropped for 2 copies of Monastery Swiftspear. This is another change that we have seen throughout the weeks, sometimes favoring having more bodies as opposed to having more auras. And we also see the 4 copies of the Battlefield Forge and the Thran Portal have been dropped for the kind of budget alternatives of the Rockish Carnival, as well as 2 mountains and 2 plains. This strategy is favored against Mono Red Aggro, giving you the life gain with the Sheltered by Ghosts can be very problematic for Mono Red. It is weak to Mono Black Midrange and Esper Self-Bounce, the Nowhere to Run getting through your Sheltered by Ghosts, and the Mono Black Midrange having a lot of removal for your targets that are going to get hit by your aura, usually resulting in a 2-for-1. The opening hand for this one is Heartfire Hero, the Optimistic Scavenger, and the Sheltered by Ghosts. Number 3 in Tier 2, according to the tracker, is Boros Auras. And this one is largely the same strategy as Mardu Aggro, just doesn't have the ability to fling off of the Callous Sellsword. And this week we see 2 plains were dropped and 3 mountains were dropped to bring in the 4 copies of the Battlefield Forge, as well as an additional copy of the Thran Portal. Boros Auras is favored against Mono Red Aggro, 5-color Reanimator, and Rakdos Aggro. It's weak against Mono Black Midrange and Esper Self-Bounce. The opening hand is Heartfire Hero, Sheltered by Ghosts, and Optimistic Scavenger, just like Mardu Aggro. Number 4 is Rakdos Aggro in Tier 2, and there are no changes to this archetype from the previous weeks. It has been relatively stable throughout the format, and it's a coin flip against Mono Red Aggro. It's weak against Mono Black Midrange and Esper Self-Bounce and Boros Auras. The opening hand, you're looking for Heartfire Hero and the Turn Inside Out. Number 5 in Tier 2 is Selesnya Rabbits, and this week we do see some changes. The Sanguine Evangelist, all 3 copies were dropped. The 2 copies of the Knight Errant of Eos were dropped, and 1 copy of the Phineas Ace Archer as well. So we're bringing in 1 copy of Season of the Burrow, which is some decent removal in top end. We're bringing in 1 Warren Warleader, and we have seen throughout the weeks kind of a choice between whether or not you're running the Warren Warleader or bringing in another Phineas. It depends on how wide you're going, and this one's going a little bit less wide because we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts, which helps improve the matchup against Mono Red Aggro, which has been a very difficult matchup for Selesnya Rabbits. So this deck is favored against mono black midrange, punishing the single point interaction or removal of mono black because a lot of these cards are multiple cards in one. And it is a coin flip against Esper Self-Bounce, again, kind of depending on who hits the Sheltered by Ghost. And then it is weak against mono red aggro, not having the interaction to slow their pace down. And the opening hand is look for the Valley Might Caller and the Pop Hatch Recruit. Number 6 is Esper Self-Bounce, and also in Tier 2. This version is not running Mockingbird. It is dropping 1 copy of Kaido. Some versions run 3 to bring in the 4 copies of the Spiteful Hexmage. This has really good synergies with the Optimistic Scavenger and Nurturing Pixie, since they're already 1/1s, and it triggers the enchantment with the Optimistic Scavenger. And we're dropping 2 copies of Go for the Throat, as well as 1 copy of Defiled Crypt, and bringing in 3 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts. So last week we were looking at a single copy, and this one's running all 4. I like all 4 personally, just because it does help you against the red matchup. So the red matchup's favored against Dimir Bounce, but a coin flip against Esper Bounce because of Sheltered by Ghosts. And then we have 2 Restless Anchorage have been dropped, as well as a Swamp to bring in an Underground River and a Darker Wastes. So Esper Self-Bounce is favored against Boros Auras, Rakdos Aggro, Mardu Aggro, Dimir Midrange, and Gruul Aggro. Pretty much destroying all aggro and combo strategies. It's a coin flip against mono red aggro and mono black midrange, Selesnya Rabbits, and Domain. And this week it wasn't looking particularly weak to anything. Its worst matchup was 48%, and making it a bad coin flip. So it's a very popular deck on the ladder, probably for that reason, having some pretty decent spread on the meta. And the opening hand, you're looking for Storm Chaser's Talent, Nurturing Pixie, and the Optimistic Scavenger. You want to start on turn 1, and these are the best cards to do. Number 7 is Mono Black Midrange at Tier 2 as well, and we've dropped 1 copy of Cutdown, 1 copy of Duress, and 1 Swamp to bring in 3 copies of the Soulstone Sanctuary. And the Soulstone Sanctuary gives you nice synergies with the Unholy Annex, since it is a shapeshifter and counts as a demon, and Cutdown helps you against aggro matchups, and Duress helps you up against control matchups. And the last best of 1 deck that we'll be covering this week is Mono White Lifegain. And we also see that this version dropped 4 planes to bring in the 4 Caves of Kolios. There is no black going on in this deck. The reason why you're bringing in the Painland is so that you can give your Essence Channeler the Vigilance and Flying during your turn. Personally, I like the Fountain Port. Being able to create the 1/1 token can kind of help with going wide while you're also dealing damage to yourself. But the ability of doing the damage to yourself without having to tap mana obviously has its advantages. So the deck is favored against mono red aggro, getting too much life gain to kind of get out of reach of the mono red strategy. It's weak against mono black midrange, where they just kind of remove your threats before they grow into some sizable thing. The best cards, though, for your opening hand are plenty in this archetype. You do not have to mulligan particularly heavily in this strategy, because Leyline of Hope, Hinterland Sanctifier, the Leonin Vanguard, the Essence Channeler, and Rune Lurker Bat, and Healer's Hawk all are all better in your opening hand. All right, and on to best of 3. So number 1, the first place winner for the standard challenge on January 31st was Dimir Self-Bounce by Marcello. And if we compare this to last week, there are no changes to this archetype in the main. However, in the sideboard, we do see that we dropped 2 Preacher of the Schisms to bring in a Blotout. And this one is particularly nice in the mirror match, being able to hit the Kaido and the Enduring Curiosity and exile them so that they don't keep coming back. And we're also bringing in a Witch's Vanity, and this is particularly nice for the aggressive strategies. Anything that has a good target for mana value 2 or less. It's good in the mirror, it's good against Gruul Prowess, that sort of thing. You're not going to want to bring this in against a strategy like Domain. Second place on January 31st was taken down by Mono Red Prowess by E. Smith. And in the main, we also see very few changes. We see 2 mountains have been dropped for 2 Soulstone Sanctuaries. And apparently this is a trend in the tournament scene that I was unaware of, that Mono Red is starting to run more of the Soulstone Sanctuaries. And I think that it helps you in the mid game, but then it also can hurt if you have Rockface Villages and Soulstone Sanctuaries. You have no way of casting your Monstrous Rage, your Burst Lightning, and your Witchstalker's Frenzy, your Lightning Strike. Like, even with just the Rockface Villages, sometimes that happens. So I'm curious to see. Obviously, being able to give it double strike with the mouse synergies in the deck makes it a fit similar to Gruul Aggro. I just haven't seen it in the archetype prior to this week. And then as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we're dropping the 2 Twisted Fealties. I really like that because we're not seeing a whole lot of Unholy Annex in the best of 3 tournament scene anymore. Which were your best targets for the Twisted Fealty. We're also dropping 1 Pyroclasm, which is better against the go wide strategies. Gruul Prowess, it's okay, but I would prefer to just have the like an additional Torch the Tower, which this one already has 4. But we've got the Obliterating Bolt, which helps out against like Azorius Oculus, also helps out against Esper Bounce and Dimir Bounce, being able to get rid of the Enduring Curiosity. We also have a Lithomatic Barrage, which also helps in that matchup, anything with blue and white. And then we also have 1 copy of the Urabrask's Forge, and we've seen this one kind of completely go away. And so bringing back a little 1 of, I think, is kind of a nod that we've seen some of the hate for Urabrask's Forge kind of lower a little bit, and there are some matchups that can kind of struggle with the Urabrask's Forge. And first place on February 1st was taken down by Jund Delirium by Owl 1013. And so it's week 12 into the format, and we're still seeing new archetypes being used, which does my soul good. So this is basically the Gruul Delirium that we've talked about before, but bringing in black for the Stick Twister, which can give you some Delirium payoffs and lifelink. And then Go for the Throat is just really premium removal. So it's very similar to what we saw in Simic Tempo or Simic Beanstalk, where you're bringing in black primarily for the sideboard to be able to get access to some of the useful tools in black, right? So the general strategy, since it is a new archetype, I'll go over it a little bit more in depth. You're trying to use like Seed of Hope. This one is not running Cash Grab. Sometimes there's other things that are helping you kind of mill cards into your graveyard. Patchwork Beastie, for example. The Paw Patch Recruit punishes the single point interaction early on, and then Fear of Missing Out can also help you fill your graveyard while also giving you the Delirium double counter or double combat, which is how you win with your Violent Urge out of nowhere. I've been surprised by this deck before, where you can just suddenly destroy your opponent when they're not expecting it. Beastie Beatdown is a sorcery to help kind of the Delirium count. Same with the Rin and Realmbreaker, just so that you have more card types and more easily activate your Delirium. Breakout helps you dig for things like the Wildfire Wickerfolk and your Fear of Missing Out. And then you've got Ominous Flytrap, which gives you the Delirium payoff as well. As a little bit more of a mid-range threat. And then you've got the Manlands with the Restless Ridgeline to close out as well. So the sideboard, we've got Torch the Tower against aggro, Ghost Vacuum against graveyard strategies, Pyroclasm against go wide strategies, Terra Sunder against artifact and enchantment, Luca Bound to Ruin. I like to bring in Planeswalkers when you're dealing against Wraths like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall, because they don't hit Planeswalkers. 3 copies of Duress is good against Control. 2 copies of Anoint with Affliction is particularly nice for sticky threats like Unstoppable Slasher. We don't see it as much, but it's good against Mosswood Dreadknight in Golgari as well. And then Preacher of the Schism is a nice stabilizing force against aggro, and you're generally going to bring it in when you need to slow the match down rather than apply more pressure to your opponent. It's worse in the control matchups. Second place on February 1st was taken down by Azorius Omniscience by Piglet, and we've talked about this one before. Seachrome Coast and a Darker Waste got dropped for a Plains and a Conduit Pylons. I like the Conduit Pylons in this build because it does give you that additional Surveil land without having to play a tap land, like the Meticulous Archive. Just gives you additional Surveil counts so that you can continue to help try to dig for your Omniscience to put it into your graveyard. The best of 3 sideboard is dropping Rona, Kitsa, Otterball Elite, and Get Lost to bring in the 2 minor missteps. So being able to counter target spell with mana value 1 or less can kind of help you get through, execute your combo and work around your opponent's counter spells. And then you also have the heroic reinforcements. So we talked about this one with the meta breakers yesterday. You can create an infinite amount of dudes with the Season of Weaving and Unnerving Grasp loop, and then give them all haste with the heroic reinforcements. And then we also have a defabricate in here, which is one that I haven't seen before, but I think is useful for the mirror match. Being able to counter one, like the Omniscience or the, I guess not the Boiler's Awakening, but the fact that it also hits activated or triggered abilities. I'm sure there's some really good targets in the meta right now that I'm just not thinking off the top of my head. So feel free to let me know in the comments below. First place on February 1st, because there's 2 sets of tournaments on Saturday, was Girl Prowess by Pato Presidente. And this one's dropping the 4 copies of the Manifold Mouse and bringing in the 4 copies of the Questing Druid, bringing in a single Paw Patch Recruit. And this is compared to the other Leyline of Resonance that I covered back in week 9. And bringing in the 4th copy of the Slickshot Show-Off. Not leaning into the 4 giant growths, but instead bringing in the Overprotect, which gives your opponent, or gives your creature hexproof. Same with the full playset of Snakeskin Veil, so running 2 additional copies of the Snakeskin Veil. And this obviously being better when you're responding to your opponent's removal rather than trying to get underneath it with the giant growths. And then we're dropping 3 mountains to run 2 copies of the Restless Ridgeline to give us a little bit of mid-range with the manlands. The best of 3 sideboard, we've got the 3 Questing Druids have been moved to the side of the main. We're dropping Lithomantic Barrage and the 3 Burst Lightnings, which can kind of help out against other aggro matchups. And instead we're running 2 additional copies of the Paw Patch Formation, which help out against any of the enchantment strategies. Zur in Domain, particularly nice against Unholy Annex. Some people like to bring it in against Dimir Bounce and Esper Bounce. That sort of thing. We've got 3 additional copies of Ghost Vacuum, so we can side into 4 copies of Ghost Vacuum, which really, to hate on the Azorius Omniscience deck, the Azorius Oculus deck, even for hitting targets like the Enduring Curiosity, some people like to bring them in against Dimir Bounce for that reason. And then we also have 4 copies of the Obstinate Baloth, and this is so that if you're coming up against the Hopeless Nightmare or Liliana or anything that's causing you to discard, you can then play the Baloth out for free. It's also halfway decent at giving you life, although this deck is usually trying to get under the other aggro deck, so you're not really going to bring it in as a stabilizing force against aggro that you would in some more like mid-rangey matchups like Golgari midrange. And then we have the 3 Screaming Nemesis, which also helps out if you're up against the damage-based removal like another Girl Prowess build. Second place on February 1st was Mono White Token Control by Marco Balaka 95. And we haven't seen Mono White Token Control for a while. And so the archetype has gone through a couple of changes since we talked about it last. This one's not running the 1 copy of Archangel of Elspeth and not running the 2 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, nor is it running the single copy of the Lauren of the Third Path, and instead is bringing in the 3 copies of the Overlord of the Mistmoors. This has been an amazing card, has been doing particularly well, creating all of those tokens. Bringing in an additional copy of the Enduring Innocence to really pump the gas on the card engines, so that you can continue to draw cards. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Soul Partition and instead bringing in 1 copy of the Elspeth Smite as well as 2 copies of the Split Up to just wrath the board. And then for the lands, we've got 4 Elegant Parlors have been removed to bring in 2 Demolition Fields as well as a Plains and a Sunken Citadel. And the reason why the Elegant Parlor was in there was because in the best of 3 sideboard, we were running the Imidane's Recruiter, which was good against Domain, and since we've seen Domain kind of disappear from the meta, I like that change to not lean into the Surveil land. So we're dropping Elspeth Smite from the sideboard, 2 copies. We're dropping 2 copies of Boonbringer Valkyrie, 2 copies of Lauren of the Third Path, 2 copies of Imidane's Recruiter, and 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown to bring in the 3 copies of the Authority of the Consuls. This is the card that kind of made Urbresk's Forge obsolete, and bringing in 1 copy of Sarah Paragon. And this is a nice way that if they don't have the ability to actually exile your stuff, you can then bring it back with a Sarah Paragon. Long ago, I posted a sideboard guide for Mono White Token Control. If you want to look at the specific matchups that I thought Sarah Paragon was good in. We're also bringing in a single copy of the Destroy Evil, which has the upside of hitting creatures with toughness 4 or greater, unlike Exercise, which is power 4 or greater, but it doesn't hit artifacts. And then we've also, so it's better against cards like Preacher of the Schism. We're also bringing in 2 copies of Split Up in the sideboard, so we can bring into a full playset of Split Up if we want to. And then we also have 1 copy of Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree. And this is a card that you're going to bring in against other strategies that are controlling when you expect the game to go to mill. Or for mana advantage, you don't necessarily need to mill your opponent out. You can just use it so that you have more lands, because generally the control player that has the more lands wins the game against other control. This one's going to be really short and sweet, but first place on February 2nd for the big Sunday tournament was Domain by Riley LBJ. And since the last time we covered it, there's no changes to the main nor the sideboard. But we will be using this to kind of talk about the second list and what changes we did see this week in that one. So this one is almost threatening to be a different archetype. Like on MTG Goldfish, one was labeled as Domain, the other was labeled as 4-color Zur, and they're both running Zur, right? They're both going for the Zur strategy. So, but they're taking kind of there's a lot of changes between the 2 lists, and so this one took down second place on February 2nd, showing that Domain is alive and well. And we're deciding to drop the Nissa Ascended Animist as well as the Tranquil Frillback that are just 1-ofs, bringing in a 1-of of the Atraxa as well as a 1-of the Beza Bounding Spring. And we're dropping Luminous Rebuke, 2 Seas from Slumber, Day of Judgment, and Temporary Lockdown and Get Lost to bring in Elspeth Smite, 2 copies, and 1 copy of Pest Control, which this one helps out against the Go Wide strategies. And then 1 additional copy of Analyze the Pollen, which can be used as a tutor effect, being able to collect evidence 8 to go grab a card. Otherwise, it just helps you hit your land drops. You've also got 2 copies of Sunfall, exile all of your problematic stuff that your opponent's playing. The 4th copy of the Leyline Binding, which I personally like because I think it pairs pretty nicely with Zur, being able to get a 6-costed enchantment animated with lifelink and all that fun stuff. And then for the lands, we're dropping Restless Anchorage and Cavern of Souls and Flood Farm Verge to bring in 2 Meticulous Archives, which is the Surveil land for Azorius, and then the Shadowy Backstreet, which is the Surveil land for Orzhov. So, similar strategy, though. I think that the decks play out largely like the same to one another. I don't think they're actually going to have substantial different matchups. We've seen kind of like, I've seen this version before too, right? It's just depends on what flavor of Domain you want to be running. And then the best of 3 sideboard also got a reasonably robust rework, 7 cards changing here. So we're dropping 1 copy of the Authority of the Consuls, just deciding 2 is enough against the aggro strategies. Dropping 1 copy of Negate, deciding 2 is enough against the control strategies. Dropping 1 Sunfall from the list and just deciding to run it in the main. Dropping Tranquil Frillback, which was, that gives you some graveyard hate if you really want to. This one's bringing in the Rest in Peace instead. Temporary Lockdown also got removed from this sideboard, and we're not running a Split Up, so just kind of going for the 4-costed or more Wraths rather than going for the lower stuff, and then leaning on Pest Control. And we've got Beza's been removed, and Nissa's been removed from the main as well. So some Domain lists will be running a Nissa in the main as well as a Nissa in the sideboard, largely depending on how much other enchantment decks you plan to bump into, right? So we do have the 2nd copy of the Pest Control if we're up against something that has a whole lot of mana value 1 or less. We do see Jeskai Convoke pop into the top 8 every once in a while. And then we also have 2 copies of Terra Sunder for the graveyard, or for the enchantment hate and artifact hate. Abstinent Baloth for 3 copies of Abstinent Baloth for against the discard strategies of Hopeless Nightmare, Liliana, etc. And then we have 2 additional copies of Rest in Peace, so a total of 3 for the graveyard-centric strategies. So thanks for listening throughout the weeks. It's been a really fun meta. I can't believe that we have had this level of diversity in Standard for Foundations, and I'm looking forward to Aether Drift very much, and really excited to see what Wizards of the Coast has cooked up. So Have a wonderful week, everybody. Tomorrow I'll be talking about my community deck tech, or doing the community deck tech. And we will be getting back to that after Aether Drift has kind of settled a little bit. Usually I give it a couple of weeks before we go back to doing brews for that sort of thing. And then I will be working on my own brews, ideally over the weekend. We'll see how it goes. Try to post that on Tuesday on release day next week, if all goes according to plan. And yeah, I'll kind of just continue to talk about the off-meta picks that have been performing well. Probably just continue doing the meta breakers this Sunday. I might skip it just because we are going to go into a new meta. So I don't know if there's going to be a lot of interest in the meta breakers, but people tend to like start exploring alternative strategies that will slot in the new cards. So if I see something like that, then I'll probably share it on Sunday. But anyway, I've rambled enough. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Good luck climbing the ladder, and good luck on your RCQs. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below. I do my best to answer them all. So, oh, and then last but not least, oh my god, I almost forgot. Shane West, 7030, thank you for the becoming a YouTube member. I appreciate the support. I kept meaning to give you a shout out, and then I'm so not used to doing those. So I really appreciate the support, and thank you everybody who has been able to help me in one way or another. I really do appreciate it. So take care.